Osama bin Laden was born in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, in 1957, into one of the wealthiest families in the kingdom. Yet his life would not follow the path of privilege and ease that his background afforded him. Instead, he became the most notorious terrorist of modern times, a man whose name struck fear across the globe, and whose vision of jihad would reshape history. His journey began during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, where he poured money, influence, and charisma into building networks of fighters. Here he gained both allies and a dangerous reputation. After the Soviets withdrew, bin Laden's war was far from over. He turned his attention to the United States, a nation he saw as the great enemy of Islam. In 1988, he founded al-Qaeda, a shadowy organization that would orchestrate violence on a scale never before seen. By the 1990s, his rhetoric was sharper, his declarations against America louder. Attacks on U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998 killed over 200 people, a brutal prelude to something far worse. And the world barely noticed the storm forming. Then came September 11, 2001, the morning when 4 planes were hijacked and nearly 3,000 lives were lost in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania. The attacks shocked the world, creating images of smoke, collapse, and chaos that remain etched in memory. Suddenly, bin Laden was the face of evil, the mastermind who had declared war on civilization itself. America responded with the War on Terror, invading Afghanistan to topple the Taliban who had given him shelter. For nearly a decade, bin Laden vanished into the shadows, his image flashing across news broadcasts. Always elusive, always out of reach, rumors placed him in caves, deserts, and secret compounds, his presence haunting the globe like a ghost. Until 2011, when U.S. Navy SEALs launched Operation Neptune Spear in Abbottabad, Pakistan, in the dead of night, storming a high-walled compound that seemed ordinary at first glance. Inside, they found him, tall, bearded, unarmed, and hiding on the 3rd floor. In moments, he was killed, ending one of the longest manhunts in modern history. His death brought relief to some, anger to others, and questions to many. Yet the shadow of Osama bin Laden still lingers, because while the man was gone, the ideology he fueled did not vanish, leaving the world to wrestle with the legacy of a figure who turned from a wealthy son into the architect of terror, and whose story reminds us of how one life can alter the course of nations. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, born Ibrahim Awad Ibrahim al-Badri in 1971 in Samarra, Iraq, rose from obscurity to become one of the most feared terrorist leaders of the modern age. His story reads like a grim thriller unfolding across decades of chaos and war. He was a quiet and religious student, earning a doctorate in Islamic studies, but beneath that scholarly exterior was a man who would soon exploit faith as a weapon. After the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, he joined the insurgency and slowly rose through the ranks. His ability to organize, manipulate, and survive marked him as different. By 2010, after the death of his predecessors, he became the leader of the Islamic State of Iraq, a group that would soon transform into ISIS, the so-called Islamic State. Under his command, ISIS grew from a fractured militant outfit into a global network of terror, spreading propaganda, fear, and brutality with cinematic precision. Cities like Mosul fell under his control in 2014, where he declared a caliphate in a chilling sermon that shook the world. Footage of him stepping into the mosque in black robes became a defining image of modern jihad. His reign was marked by unspeakable violence, mass executions, slavery, and destruction of heritage sites. He masterminded attacks not only in the Middle East but also inspired bloodshed across Europe and beyond. Intelligence agencies worldwide hunted him, yet he evaded capture for years, moving between tunnels, safe houses, and loyal tribes, always just out of reach. His myth grew as he disappeared into the shadows. For his followers, he was a symbol of defiance. For the world, he was the embodiment of ruthless fanaticism. U.S. forces came close many times but missed. Each failed attempt deepened the suspense, until October 2019, when intelligence finally closed in. Cornered in a compound in Syria, Baghdadi detonated a suicide vest, killing himself and his children. In a final act of defiance, President Trump announced his death with stark words, declaring he died like a dog. Yet the legacy he left behind remains haunting. His caliphate was dismantled, but the ideology lingers. Carlos the Jackal, born Ilich Ramirez Sanchez in Venezuela in 1949, became one of the most infamous terrorists of the late 20th century, a man whose name alone sparked fear across Europe and the Middle East. His journey began in the world of radical student politics before he was recruited by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and soon his actions would catapult him onto the international stage. In December 1975, he led a daring raid on an OPEC meeting in Vienna, where he and his team stormed the conference, killed 3 people, and took more than 60 hostages including oil ministers. This single event branded him as Carlos the Jackal, a name given by the press after a copy of Frederick Forsyth's thriller The Day of the Jackal was found among his belongings. But what the world did not see was the network of safe houses, intelligence contacts, and shadowy financiers that kept him moving from one city to another. For years he evaded capture while orchestrating bombings, assassinations, and plots that struck at embassies, airlines, and businesses. His life became a cinematic chase, with European intelligence agencies, the Mossad, and the CIA all hunting him, yet he slipped through their fingers time and again. Allies described him as charismatic and ruthless, a man who could speak several languages and move easily through the cosmopolitan hubs of Cold War Europe. But to his enemies he was nothing more than a calculating killer. His notoriety grew with every newspaper headline, every photograph of him in sunglasses and leather jacket, every whispered rumor of his next move. By the 1980s his influence began to wane, as sponsors abandoned him and former comrades turned against him. Still he managed to hide in Syria and later Sudan, living a life of exile but never far from the shadows of violence. Then in 1994, in a stunning twist, French intelligence finally cornered him in Khartoum. After years of myth and mystery, he was flown to Paris, put on trial, and sentenced to life imprisonment. His legend, however, refuses to die, because even today Carlos the Jackal represents a dark symbol of international terrorism, a reminder of how one man, moving through the cracks of a divided world, could hold entire nations hostage with fear. And while his story has faded from the daily news, the echoes of his actions still shape the global fight against terror, forcing us to ask how a single individual can become larger than life, larger than truth, and larger than history itself. Ayman al-Zawahiri was not born into obscurity. He was born in Cairo in 1951 into a wealthy and respected family of doctors and scholars. And from the start, his life carried the tension between privilege and radical belief. He studied medicine and became a surgeon. But behind the calm image of a doctor was a man consumed with ideology, a man who believed in violent revolution against secular regimes and Western influence. By his 20s, he was already arrested for being part of Egypt's underground Islamist movement, and that prison time only hardened him, shaping him into a voice of radical defiance. When he later crossed paths with Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan during the war against the Soviets, history was altered because al-Zawahiri did not just become bin Laden's ally, he became his mentor and his strategist, the quiet thinker behind the loud warrior. While bin Laden provided wealth and charisma, Zawahiri provided doctrine, plans, and a chilling sense of long-term vision. Together they forged al-Qaeda into a network that would reach across the globe. And when the towers fell on September 11, 2001, Zawahiri's fingerprints were there in the shadows, even though his name was less known. After bin Laden's death in 2011 at the hands of U.S. Navy SEALs, Zawahiri stepped out of the shadows and into the leadership. But unlike his predecessor, he lacked magnetism. He was more scholar than soldier, more ideologue than icon. And yet under his rule, al-Qaeda remained dangerous, fragmenting but spreading, embedding itself in conflicts from Yemen to Syria. The man appeared on grainy videos with stern lectures, a professor of terror addressing the world. But always he was elusive, always hidden, until 2022, when U.S. intelligence tracked him to a safe house in Kabul, in the heart of Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. One quiet morning, a drone fired 2 Hellfire missiles, and the most wanted terrorist in the world was killed on a balcony without warning. No one else died. The precision was absolute. And with that strike, decades of manhunts reached their end. But the story of Zawahiri lingers. Because he was not just one man, he was the embodiment of a movement, the quiet doctor turned global terrorist mastermind. Ramzi Yousef, a name that still echoes in the shadows of global terrorism, entered the world stage with fire, smoke, and calculated violence. His most infamous act being the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, a plot designed to topple one of the towers into the other, a scheme that failed in its ultimate goal but succeeded in killing 6 people and injuring over 1,000. A chilling preview of what was yet to come. And here's where it gets darker, because Yousef was not a lone wolf. He was a trained mastermind, born in Kuwait to Pakistani parents, educated in Britain, and hardened in Afghan training camps where ideology fused with tactical precision. And he quickly became one of the most dangerous men on the planet, operating with cold detachment and cinematic flair, slipping through borders and false identities like a ghost, yet always leaving behind a trail of devastation. His fingerprints extended beyond New York, weaving into plots like the Bojinka scheme in the Philippines, a terrifying plan to blow up a dozen U.S. airliners mid-flight across the Pacific, a plan that could have killed thousands if it had succeeded. And take a look at the audacity of his thinking, because he also plotted to assassinate Pope John Paul II during a visit to Manila, and even eyed an attack on President Bill Clinton, each step raising the stakes, each moment escalating the sense of dread. But Yousef's downfall came not through his arrogance, but through a stroke of fortune for investigators. When a fire in a Manila apartment exposed the Bojinka plot, revealing encrypted files and bomb-making materials that linked directly back to him. And this was the break authorities needed, sparking a global manhunt that spanned continents. Finally, in February 1995, Yousef was captured in Pakistan by U.S. and Pakistani intelligence, dragged from his safe house and flown to America in shackles. His reign of terror finally over, yet the haunting legacy of his actions remained, foreshadowing the catastrophic 9/11 attacks that followed years later, carried out by men who shared his vision and his methods. In court, he showed no remorse, instead boasting of his crimes and framing them as acts of war, and the chilling truth is that his ideas lived on long after his prison door slammed shut, making him not just a man of destruction, but a harbinger of a darker era in global security. Anders Behring Breivik. On July 27, 2011, Norway was shaken by a tragedy so horrific that it would forever mark the nation's history. Anders Behring Breivik, a 32-year-old far-right extremist, carried out the deadliest attack in Norway since World War II, first detonating a massive car bomb in Oslo's government district that killed 8 people and left buildings torn apart, smoke rising above the city, and terrified civilians running through the streets. Then, dressed as a police officer, he calmly traveled to the island of Utøya where the Labour Party's youth camp was underway. What followed was a massacre of chilling calculation. Breivik hunted down teenagers, methodically moving through the camp, calling out to victims before opening fire. By the time police arrived, 69 people, most of them under 20, lay dead. The nation was paralyzed by grief, but also by disbelief. How could one man carry out such destruction so deliberately and with such cold intent? Investigators soon uncovered Breivik's 1,500-page manifesto, a rambling document filled with extremist ideology, anti-immigrant rhetoric, and a warped justification for violence. He had spent years preparing, stockpiling weapons, researching explosives, and rehearsing his plan. The precision revealed a mind not driven by impulse, but by meticulous obsession. In court, Breivik showed no remorse, raising his arm in a Nazi-style salute, delivering chilling statements about his so-called mission. The trial became not just a legal process, but a national reckoning. Survivors testified about hiding under beds, swimming for their lives, or playing dead among the bodies. Norway, a country known for peace and tolerance, faced the brutal reality of homegrown terror. The court declared him sane, sentencing him to 21 years of preventive detention, a sentence that can be extended indefinitely if he is still deemed dangerous. To this day, the image of that quiet island turned into a killing field haunts the collective memory. Breivik remains imprisoned, occasionally making headlines with outrageous demands and attempts to spread his ideology. Yet Norway has also sought to reclaim the narrative, honoring the victims, strengthening its democratic ideals, and refusing to let one man's hatred define them. But the question lingers like a shadow. How does a society safeguard itself from the lone extremist who hides behind normality until the moment of devastation? Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was not born into terror, but into poverty in 1966 in the dusty Jordanian city of Zarqa, a place that would give him his infamous name. And while his early years showed no sign of the global chaos he would unleash, he soon found himself drawn to violence and extremist ideology, first in petty crime and later through a brutal sense of destiny. When he traveled to Afghanistan in the late 1980s to join the fight against the Soviets, where he met radical clerics and absorbed a worldview that transformed him. But even there he was seen as reckless and more obsessed with brutality than strategy. Yet that reckless fire would become his signature, because after returning to Jordan he was imprisoned, hardened, and by the time he was released in 1999, he was no longer a thug, he was a fanatic, a man on a mission, and he headed straight for Afghanistan once more, this time to set up his own training camps. Independent of Osama bin Laden, though he would later swear allegiance to al-Qaeda in Iraq, the group that would make his name feared, and feared it was because Zarqawi pioneered a new brand of terror, one that relied not just on bombs but on spectacle. His videotaped beheadings became symbols of sheer horror, His attacks on Shia Muslims ignited a sectarian war in Iraq, and his bombings in Baghdad and beyond spread chaos across the region. Take a look at the impact because while bin Laden targeted the West with surgical strikes like 9/11, Zarqawi unleashed carnage with no boundaries, creating a climate where every marketplace, every mosque and every street corner could become a killing ground. His name was whispered as a phantom of death, but his brutality also divided the jihadist movement, with some al-Qaeda leaders criticizing his tactics as too extreme. Yet for Zarqawi, fear was the point, and in those years after the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, his legend grew darker by the day until the hunt began, and U.S. forces, aided by intelligence and Jordanian operatives, closed in. The climax came on June 7, 2006, when an American airstrike hit his safe house near Bakuba, ending the life of the man who thrived on blood and fire. His death was broadcast across the world as a victory, but the seeds he planted, the sectarian violence and the blueprint for ISIS, lived on long after. And the shadow of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi still lingers in every act of terror that followed, raising the chilling question: did killing the man stop the movement, or did it only give it a martyr to grow stronger? Mohammed Atta, a name that would later become synonymous with terror, was born in Egypt in 1968, raised in a conservative household where discipline and religion were deeply ingrained. Yet, it was not until his studies in Hamburg, Germany, that his path began to darken. Take a look at what happened. Atta moved to Hamburg in the early 1990s to study urban planning, a quiet, seemingly studious man who blended into the fabric of university life. But behind the calm exterior, he was increasingly drawn to radical Islamic ideology. He frequented mosques where fiery sermons echoed calls for jihad, and soon formed connections with a circle of like-minded men. This was the so-called Hamburg Cell, the nucleus of what would later become the deadliest terrorist plot on American soil. Investigators would later piece together how Atta's charisma and stern resolve made him the de facto leader of the group, directing conversations, insisting on discipline, and envisioning a strike so massive it would shake the foundations of the West. By the late 1990s, Atta traveled to Afghanistan, where he came face-to-face with al-Qaeda's leadership. Here the plans sharpened. Training camps forged him into a commander of precision and secrecy. Osama bin Laden and his inner circle saw in him a man of cold determination, and entrusted him with a central role in the operation that would define a generation. Fast forward to early 2001, Atta was already inside the United States, moving quietly, taking flight lessons in Florida, blending into the background, paying in cash, and never revealing his true intent. The instructors remembered him as serious, intense, and sometimes hostile, but no one could imagine what he was preparing for. Take a look at the timeline. On September 11, 2001, at 8:46 a.m., Mohammed Atta piloted American Airlines Flight 11 into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. The impact was devastating, a fireball of jet fuel exploding outward, shocking the world into silence. Witnesses described the horror as smoke billowed into the clear morning sky, and in that instant, Atta became the face of the unthinkable. Yet the question lingers: how did a quiet student transform into the orchestrator of mass murder? Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button. Subscribe for more awesome content, and turn on the bell so you never miss an upload. If you have any video ideas, please let me know in the comment section. Have a great rest of your day.